welcome to BBC News. I'm Bradley Graham. We start this report with news from our allies from across the pond and the increased tensions between the US and the USSR. Following the failed invasion of Cuba, it is rumoured that a secret agreement was reached between the Russians and Cuba to have nuclear missiles placed in Cuba, missiles that could be launched into the United States. The Kremlin argue that this is in response to the United States placing missiles in Turkey. America's response is to blockade Cuba to prevent the transfer of more missiles. Cuba argues that those missiles need to be there to prevent America from invading again. After increased tensions, the USSR agrees to remove the missiles if the US agreed not to invade Cuba again. The BBC presents exclusive interviews with Russian Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Fidel Castro's personal secretary, and America's First Lady, Jackie Kennedy. Welcome, I'm here with Jackie Kennedy, First Lady of the United States. I have a few questions to ask you about the Cuban Missile Crisis. When did you start feeling threatened by Cuba?
When Fidel Castro took power, it scared us because of his communistic policies. We assumed he had ties with the Soviet Union. Then the government of Cuba started taking over U.S. businesses, which was alarming to us. The problem was Cuba was close enough to the USSR to attack almost any U.S. city with nukes, so we were threatened from the feeling that there would be a coming attack from them.
Why did you try to blockade Cuba?
We feared that there would be an attack, as the Cubans weren't fond of us, and they were working with the Soviets, and since there were nukes on the island, it made the idea of an attack more real for us. Many associates actually argued for a full-blown attack of Cuba to wipe out the missiles, but the president decided on a naval quarantine instead. This way we could also receive support from the Organization of American States to avoid war in the process and protecting our nation.
So what made you decide to negotiate with the Soviets?
For the sake of the well-being of the American people, we thought it would be the best thing to do to try to end conflict between nations whose war could ensue complete destruction of many countries. Though the Soviets were an enemy, after much thought from the proposal, it was seen as something that needed to be done.
So what exactly was the agreement between the United States and the USSR?
The Soviets proposed to us that they would remove all missiles from Cuba if we promised to not invade them, yet shot down planes over Cuba just a day after, causing us to fear the authenticity of their proposal. Yet, after a second-long emotional message we ignored, the proposed agreement from our side was to have the missiles removed from Cuba after supervision and the UN, and the agreement that the US wouldn't attack them.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. I'm here with Fidel Castro's personal secretary, and I have a few questions to ask her. So why did you agree to let missiles be put on your island?
We actually requested missiles so we would be able to protect ourselves against further harassment from the U.S. after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. We thought this would deter the U.S. from further attempting to replace our administration.
Okay. What was the agreement you reached with the Soviets?
They agreed that we had a common enemy, being the U.S., and in secret we began to build missiles in October.
Okay. Why did you decide to turn your administration communist?
Castro believed that the root cause of our poverty was capitalism. Capitalism kept the riches with the rich and prevented fair distribution of wealth. The question of success was almost entirely dependent on the life you were born into. So he decided that communism would be the best way to increase the affluence of Cuba.
How do you think the average Cuban or the Cuban government feel about the military blockade?
We feel that it's a bit extreme. We are just trying to protect ourselves, as the U.S. has never been in question if it's been able to do.
Hello, I'm here with the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom and with a few questions, hopefully you can answer. Number one, why did you put the missiles in Cuba?
Well, the Americans tried to overthrow our friends in Cuba, so we needed a deterrent against future attacks. We're just trying to protect our ally. Cuba was to us what West Berlin was to America, a small piece of land deep in enemy territory that we, as a superpower, are compelled to protect. The U.S. was willing to use nuclear arms to protect Berlin, so why couldn't we?
And how do you feel about the blockade the United States put on Cuba?
I think the blockade took away our rights as a world power to send aid to our allies. It's no different from our cruel Berlin blockade. America is overreacting to our attempts to fortify our ally. They have missiles in Turkey, so why shouldn't we be able to put missiles in Cuba?
And what was the agreement you reached with Cuba?
Our ally, Cuba, wanted protection from the encroaching American threat, and in the aftermath of America's uncalled-for invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, we couldn't refuse. They wanted us to send them missiles to use as a deterrent against future invasions, and we happily obliged.
What was the agreement you reached with the United States?
We wanted the U.S. to promise not to invade Cuba again and to take its missiles out of Turkey. In return, we would take our weapons out of Cuba. America completely ignored our second request and still expected a diplomatic solution. We were forced to accept. If we didn't have the foresight to try and prevent a nuclear war, the world may have been turned into a desolate wasteland.
Thank you. Thank you for watching, and good night.
Welcome to the BBC News. I'm Elena Crespo, and today we look back on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Exactly 50 years ago, on September 20th, 1962, the USSR and the USA reached an agreement to end the nuclear stalemate by removing missiles from Greece, Turkey, and Cuba. Today we look at the lasting effects of this agreement. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to the future demise of the USSR, weakened Russian pride and nationalism, and was viewed as an act of cowardice. The Soviets also lost an important ally, China, who viewed them as weak. The USA clearly emerged the victor and did not hold up to their side of the bargain until much later. They gained national prestige, and thanks to the diplomacy of President Kennedy, they were able to navigate a potentially dangerous situation. The president then placed a permanent embargo on Cuba, dooming them to the isolation from their neighbor. The embargo is ongoing, leaving Cuba behind in technology and military. Thank you for watching this special presentation of the BBC News.